Okay, welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us for this week's Backyard Forestry. I'm Rich Kelsky, Vice President of the Forestry Association, and with us tonight is Dr. Dan Duran. And I'll just start with a brief presentation. So tonight's presentation is Young Successional Forests Promote Biodiversity and Healthier Ecosystems. And before we begin, I wanted to give a big thank you to those folks who presented last month, Ellie Benz and Basil O'Connor, for educating us on estate and succession planning for woodland owners. They did a great job. We're here on the third Thursday of every month. Every month, we don't miss. And we hope that you will not miss one of our presentations as well. But if you do, you can always watch it online. We are running the 2024 New Jersey Woodland Stewards Program. We've had a lot of inquiries about that. In fact, it is sold out at the moment. We have been oversubscribed. We have a wait list. So if you're interested in joining the wait list, go to our website at njforestry.org and click on the link, and you can join the wait list. And if a spot opens, we will let you know. Now, what does the Forestry Association do? We do a lot of different things. We do a ton of outreach, as you know, through this program, the Walk in the Woods program, Woodland Stewards program, and others. We monitor legislation that affects woodlands, and we speak for woodland owners in New Jersey who manage properties, both public and private. And we produce a newsletter, we conduct an annual meeting, and we do a lot of good things. So if you're feeling generous and think of us, please donate. Tonight's presenter is Dan Duran, PhD. Dr. Duran is an assistant professor in the Department of Environmental Science at Rowan University and naturalist for Scotland Run Park. He's published research papers on new methods for species discovery, biodiversity science, and molecular phylogenetics. And I'll leave Dan to give more particulars about himself during the course of his presentation. Tonight, we're going to do a couple of things that you may not have seen before. In the last Backyard Forestry, we introduced anonymous polling with interesting questions and interesting results. And we're also going to have a little surprise giveaway at the end of the event of Sibley's Birding Basics and Managing Forests for Birds, a Forester's Guide. And we'll explain the process for that, but it's for people who are on at the end of the event.
So thanks for having me tonight. This is really great. Yeah, we're going to be talking about the important role of young forests in promoting biodiversity and healthier ecosystems. And I appreciate the introduction and looking forward to talking to everybody about this at the end. We'll have some questions and we'll have some discussions. So outline of what I'm going to talk about tonight. One is, what is ecological succession? What does that even mean? That's a term that scientists use on a regular basis, but a lot of people have never really heard that before. We're going to talk about what it is and why it matters. We're going to talk about the vital importance of early successional habitats for a number of reasons that we'll get into. We're going to talk about recent research on forest management and the effects of that on ecology. And then lastly, I am not an expert forester, so if you want to learn more about this, you might want to ask some more people in the New Jersey Forestry Association, but we're going to talk very briefly about how to create and maintain young forests. So just want to start out and say, you know, people, when they think of forests, when they think of nature, they often think of a scene that looks something like this, which is a beautiful picture in an absolutely gorgeous area. This would probably qualify for almost for sure as old growth forest. And this is an area in the Pacific Northwest, if I remember correctly, where this picture was taken. And it is the idea that people have of forest. People don't tend to think of this when they think of forest. This is just not what generally people have in their mind. And I want to talk about how those are both important things and how we should really think about, you know, how there's a role for all of these different types of forest. And so first I want to talk about succession. And succession is the replacement of one ecological community by another over time. And so when we say ecological community, we're talking about all of the different living things living together in a single place and time. And so what you can see is during succession, something may happen where there's some sort of a disturbance, whether that be fire, a windstorm, you know, some type of flooding, volcanic activity, glacial retreat. There's all kinds of different things that can happen. Or in the case of human-made activities, it could be having agriculture, which then gets abandoned and turns back into ultimately a forest or something like that. And so after this disturbance, you're going to see there's going to be nothing there, maybe, or a lot of things gone. And so you have this fire, you have this windstorm, you have whatever, and the ground may open up. And right after that, you're going to see some things that we call pioneer species, things that come right in, annual plants, really weedy things that are going to have a lot of seeds. They're going to generally be small. They're going to grow really fast, and they're going to get going, and they're going to take over. They may either come in from seeds that blow from nearby areas, or they may actually be seeds that are already sitting there in the soil in the seed bank and then get started now that the coast is clear. So those are going to get started right away. We're going to see a lot of growth in the first couple of years, and then a few years later, we're going to see some replacement of these annual plants with maybe grasses and perennial plants that might live for a few years and may have a little bit different root systems and grow a little bit slower, but maybe are better competitors. And so they actually push out these weedy young annual plants. Given enough time, eventually this is going to turn into something that we could call an old field or a young forest. We're going to see a transition. We're going to talk about this in more detail and show more pictures of that, but there's going to be this transition from grasses to shrubs to small trees to getting bigger trees, and ultimately, given enough time, let's say 150 years plus, this is going to become a forest that doesn't change a whole lot. After about 150 years, it depends on where you are in the world and a lot of factors, but roughly around 150 years, you typically see something that we could call a climax community, also known as old growth. And so this is going to have mature trees that are very large. The understory will be fairly, there won't be a lot of things in the understory compared to some other types of habitats. There's still growth there, but the trees are going to be a lot more spaced apart. The trees are going to be old. The trees are going to be large. That's typically what we would expect. And so let's go through an example here in our part of the world, right? So this is the New Jersey Pine Barrens. This is an area in Manchester Township where, due to fire and other events, there were open sand dunes. And what happens is shortly after this disturbance, you start to see things like certain types of grasses. We have a sickle leaf golden aster coming in here, really great, fairly rare plant that's getting started out here. Eventually, this will become a meadow or an old field. Over time, it's going to greatly increase the diversity of wildflowers and grasses that live in this place. And you can see several things here. We have some liatris, which is a type of plant called a blazing star sometimes. Really great, excellent, going to attract a lot of insects. Give it a little bit more time, you're going to still have your grasses and your wildflowers, but you're going to start to see some shrubs coming up. In this case, we can see there's a couple different things that are coming up. I can see some pines. There might be some sweet gum or something. I can't really tell what the one tree is there on the right side, but there's shrubs that are coming in. There's probably eastern red cedar. Lots of things are going to start to go, and it's going to transition into a place where there's going to be some grasses, some flowers, but now more shrubs, more small trees, and it's going to end up becoming eventually something that looks like this. Although this isn't old growth, there's not a lot of old growth in New Jersey. This is a sort of late middle-aged forest. So the forest here is probably about 75 to 80 years old, based on what I knew from this photograph. And so there's going to be a lot of oaks, not as many pines. There's going to be a very different understory than it was earlier in its forest life stage. And the plants are going to create a change in the animal diversity as well. So we're going to see over time, as succession continues, we're going to see a change in the birds. We're going to see a change in the mammals. We're going to certainly see a change in the insects, although that's very complicated. There are many insects, and we don't have a graph of that. But trust me, the insects are the first thing to change when the plants change. And then you get all these different kinds of birds. In the early successional stages, we're going to get things like meadow mice, field sparrows, grasshopper sparrows. Things like veeries are only at the end. They're in the deep, dark forest. We have some things like short-tailed shrews. They don't care. I mean, if there's ground, they're going to be underground, and they don't really care whether it's a field or a forest. So some things don't care, but most things, if you notice these lines, you'll see that most species do have a range of successional stages that they tend to hang out in. Black-throated green warblers tend to be, in that forested stage. It's not quite the end of succession, not quite old growth, but, maybe more towards that side of things. So yeah, so there's all those different stages of succession, and they're all part of nature. But I want to see, what do people think of when they think of nature? What do they visualize? And so I just did a simple Google search, and I put in terms like nature and wilderness. And when I did this, one of the first images that came up was this, I mean, beautiful image here, right? This is crazy. I mean, you don't see a lot of places that look like this, but this is kind of what I expected. This is a place where it's very deep, it's very dark. There's almost no shrubs. There's some growth under the trees, but this is exactly the kind of thing where people think of the end stage. And the same thing with forest. When I put in forest, I get all of these very, very, very late successional forests with big trees, widely spaced, very tall, very dense at the canopy. And so that's kind of what I expected. And so really, when you come right down to it, when people, your average person thinks about nature, they think about that, just that area at the very end. And there's so much more than that. Now, that's an important stage, and every single stage is important. And we'll talk about this more. Old growth forests are extremely important. So are the other stages. And in some ways, the other stages may actually be more important, as we will talk about. But let's kind of focus a little bit more on the beginning of this successional diagram here. So there's a very famous paper called The Strategy of Ecosystem Development, written by Eugene Odom, one of the most sort of prolific and well-esteemed ecologists in the whole world of all time. Absolutely fantastic scientist, brilliant. And he wrote this really interesting article. And I like this one little excerpt here that I thought was really interesting. He said the safest landscape, and when we talk about safe as far as the likelihood of it being stable and sustainable, the safest landscape to live in is one containing a variety of crops, forests, lakes, streams, roadsides, marshes, seashores, and, quote, waste places. In other words, a mixture of communities of different ecological ages. Could not agree more with this. I love that he said the term waste places, because I've seen so many people look at an old field and say, oh, that's a shame. That could be something natural. That could be a forest. That could be where, and actually those places are extremely important. And so this is the problem that we have with perception. People are unaware of this. And so an important concept for people to understand, I think, that I hope I'll get through here, is that biodiversity is not evenly distributed throughout time and throughout succession. And it's not at all what you'd think. It's not at all what you'd think. Probably one of the first famous papers to look at this was Whitaker in 1970, but this has been shown a near infinite number of times. This is completely well established, and nobody really doubts this. It's a professional scientist. It's well known that there is a major increase in biodiversity shortly after succession starts. So whether that be fire, or again, a human-made thing like either logging or abandonment of agriculture, or whether it be, some disaster like a tornado or something like that, you're going to see a really quick jump up in biodiversity. And then it's actually going to hit a peak, and then it's actually going to decline. Now, keep in mind, I want to explain really importantly to the Eugene Odom, what he said was very true. It doesn't mean, just because biodiversity declines towards the end doesn't mean that there's no value to these deep, dark forests. Of course there are. There's lots of values. But if you're just talking about biodiversity and the total number of species that an ecosystem can hold, it is highest towards the beginning, middle. And so if we look at this and kind of map across here, you can see fields have a lot of biodiversity. That shrub to young forest stage and the field interface is where the highest diversity is in all of ecological succession. And then it goes down, and it kind of tapers off at some point when it gets close to the climax forest. Now, the biomass, which is the total amount of standing, living, and dead biological material, so like tree trunks and leaves and, mice and all of the just living and now dead parts of biology, that does actually go up over time and continues over time. But the biodiversity, the living things, and the number of species of living things, like I said, does not continue to go up. It actually goes down. So I'm going to focus on 3 different groups of organisms primarily for this talk. I'm going to talk about plants, because plants are the basis for, well, life, right? You don't have any plant. If you don't have any plants, you don't have any life. That they're necessary for all other things to survive. insects are the most diverse things on the planet, and even more than there are types of plants, there are more types of insects, and about 1 million species of insects, about 300,000 species of plants. And so those are going to be the majority of life on Earth are plants and insects, is 80% of all living things. We're also going to talk about birds because birds are a really good surrogate for every other group of animals. Birds eat insects, and almost all birds do eat insects. About 96% of bird species eat insects at some point in their life. So birds are a really great surrogate for sort of the next level up in ecology. So if we look, we can see there's so many species of plants that live in these early successional habitats, many things that are either rare or beautiful. We have things like tuberous, Calopogon tuberosa, which is tuberous grass pink. We have different types of gentians. We have Carolina redroot, all kinds of different things. We have some other plants that might live in a little bit more upland, a little drier places, like our tuberosa or Asclepias tuberosa, our butterfly weed right there, and our colic root to the left. There are lots and lots of insects that live in open early successional habitats. This here is a tiger beetle. This is the purple tiger beetle or the cowpath tiger beetle, and they almost exclusively live in open successional habitats. If you don't find these really early places where there's bare ground and maybe some grasses and some wildflowers, then you just don't find them. They don't occur, and they're arguably very important for a number of ecological reasons, including they're some of the only predators of fire ants in the southeastern United States. So that's really good to know. By the way, this is the group that I study. This is what I'm a world's expert in, is tiger beetles, and so they're pretty cool. But you would not find them in a deep dark forest very often. There are a few species, but the vast majority of them are in early successional habitats. And many of our moths and butterflies are found in early successional habitats. This is a young forest that's starting to grow up. This here is not a butterfly. A lot of people think this is a butterfly. It's absolutely beautiful. There's so many beautiful moths. This is a Promethean moth. And this was I took this picture shortly after they really started to rebound in the early 2000s. They were just almost completely decimated by an introduced insect that was wiping them out, and now they've come back pretty well. So you can actually find them again. And this here is a common yellowthroat, which is a beautiful little bird, common all over the place when you have early successional habitats. As long as it's kind of shrubby, maybe some open grasses next to some shrubby areas, you're regularly going to find common yellowthroats. They're really, really, really beautiful birds. And when we're talking about these early successional habitats, they may meet up with later successional habitats, and these habitat edges can actually have totally different communities than the adjacent successional areas. They can have the combination of species that occur in both areas plus ones that don't occur in either. So first I want to kind of go over a little bit of a couple of terms here. So if we have, let's say the darker green on the left is a forest and the lighter green on the right is a field. If there was a really abrupt change in the ecological community there, let's say maybe there was a mowing, or maybe there was a fire, right off the bat, it's going to be a really narrow border between them. It's basically going to be a straight line, and there's really very little transition zone. An area known as an ecotone is when there's a wider transition, and it may actually have a whole bunch of species that occur in there that don't occur in either habitat outside of it. And I want to kind of show you how we get to that. But first, this here, it's a really interesting picture. I don't know what's going on. Maybe one of the foresters can tell me more. The density of trees there is absolutely absurd. I don't know I don't know if this is being, intentionally grown for something, but for like logging or something like that. But whatever this is, there's this incredibly dense forest, and it's next to this mowed field, and there's very, very little transition. It goes straight from field to forest. It would be so great if just 1% of that edge was made just a little bit wider. There could be so many more species in there with such a minimal investment of space. And so we could see that going from this narrow border to a wider border. And let me show you how this happens over successional time. So when you start right out, you've got this really abrupt border, you've got your forest, you've got your field, it's total high contrast. What's going to happen is some plants are going to love that edge. They're going to love to get in that edge because that edge is going to have a different light regime than either the forest or the field. It might get 6 hours of sun as opposed to the field, which may get even more, and certainly a lot different than the actual forest, and so there's going to get a decent amount of sun, and these things might need a couple of hours of shade a day. So they're going to be in those places. They're going to grow on that edge, and over time, they are going to create a new part of this border. And then as they grow, other things will grow under them, and it's going to widen out and widen out. And we're going to see this much more different type of structure to the ecotone. Here's some pictures of some ecotones in the pine barrens that I photographed that I thought were really particularly beautiful and remarkable. So this was a spot near Millville, Buckshootum Creek, and I was there right after they had done some forest management, and it was amazing to see what was going on with the diversity of flowers and insects just a couple of years afterwards. And so here we can see some what do you call it? Mountain laurel. Couldn't come up with the name for a minute. Mountain laurel. There's some mountain laurel in this picture. There's some sheep laurel. There's some sassafras. There's a whole bunch of different plants. And it's really diverse. It's really, really diverse. And like I said, because these habitats have elements of both adjacent habitats and this transitional area that's different than both, they sometimes get these species that just love to live in them. So in the upper left corner, we can see that really beautiful white flowered small tree. That's a serviceberry. Serviceberries love these edges. They're really going to be found in ecotones. You're not going to find them as much in the forest, and you're not going to generally find them out in the open fields. They're going to love these edges. And in the lower right corner, we can see some bayberry. And bayberry loves ecotones as well. Usually wetter, usually a little saltier, but they are an ecotone specialist as well. And many different types of insects are ecotone specialists. We can see here, this is a clubtail dragonfly. They will only be found in these ecotones. They love to fly transects back and forth and hunt mosquitoes in places where you have a forest next to a field. Things like bluebirds. Bluebirds love ecotones. Bluebirds are definitely ecotone specialists. If there's a field and it's next to a forest, that's a great place to find a bluebird. And then we have ones like our eastern kingbird, which will not only be edge specialists, like we just said for the bluebird, they often really like specific types of perches that are right out over the edge, maybe hanging into the sort of more open areas. And so that often ends up being power lines or barbed wire, different types of wires like that. So here's an interesting question. Do mature forest birds that like those interior, deep, dark, later successional forests, do they prefer early successional habitat when they're in the post-fledging period, when they're right after they're young or getting going? And so that's a really interesting question, because people will say, oh, well, we have birds like veeries and they live in the later successional forest, but do they really only live there? And so there was a really interesting study where they looked at this, and they took a number of sort of forest species of birds. We can see at the top, we can see a Blackburnian warbler, a red-eyed vireo, and then a Swainson's thrush. And all of these birds were looked at. There were, I think, 9 species of birds, and they found that 7 of them had a strong preference for either natural wildlife openings, things that maybe there was a tree fall, maybe there was a fire, maybe there was a tornado, something that opened up the canopy a lot, or even man-made clear cuts. In some cases, they actually preferred those over the deep, dark forest. So that was very interesting. An example here, there's our Blackburnian warbler. You can see the wildlife openings in the clear cut. They spent more time than they did in the darker forest. And in the case of the red-eyed vireo, which was a little surprising to me, it was dramatic how much more time they spent outside of the forest. And so that's an interesting thing. And one of the questions is, okay, so we know that the majority of biodiversity resides in early successional and ecotone habitats. What about specifically rare and endangered species? Because maybe most species live in these early successional habitats and these edge habitats, but maybe our rare and endangered species don't follow that same pattern. And so I thought it'd be good to look into this and try to, quantify this a little bit. And so here's a list of endangered plant species and plant species of special concern from New Jersey. I had a good list from New Jersey. From the other taxa, I have a global list or national list, but I had a great list of endangered plants from New Jersey. And if you look at these plants on this list, I'm just showing you page one. This is just one window of the whole list. It's very long. You can see that almost all of them, all the ones in yellow, are ones that like either early successional habitats, young forest, or ecotones, edges of young forest with edges of deeper, darker forest. So that's really interesting. Really, the balsam fir and the red baneberry are the only species on this list that don't fit that pattern. Overwhelmingly, our rare species are in early successional forest. And so here's a list of, again, just one page of a many page list from the Fish and Wildlife Service listed, so federally endangered U.S. species of insects. And it's showing them there. And literally everyone on this page is an early successional specialist. I know many of these insects very well. Again, I am an entomologist by training. I study tiger beetles and ground beetles, Elaphris viridis. I know them very well. And I was not surprised that most of these, or actually in this case, all of these butterflies, damselflies, beetles, etc., they're all found in early successional habitats. What about birds? Birds are notorious where people say, oh, but they need the sort of later successional forest. All of our rare ones on this page, every single one is an early successional or an ecotone specialist. So this is a really strong pattern that we're seeing here. It's even more important than I think people realize. Here's an example of one of our New Jersey endangered plants. This here, I'm sure some of you know, is a pine barrens gentian. And pine barrens gentians only occur in places after disturbance, usually in the first 5 to 10 years after disturbance, and then they start to kind of go away. One of the reasons they're so frequently found in places like power line right-of-ways is because they are frequently mowed or brush hogged. And so they're actually going to keep the conditions as if there was a fire, as if there was a natural disturbance, and it benefits this particular species because it removes competitors, because they're not good at competing once succession really starts to get going. Here's another one. Here's our orange fringed orchid, really beautiful, going to really be found where it's still grassy, where it's still open, not in the deep dark forest. This is an interesting butterfly here. This is Hessel's hairstreak. This is a specialist that feeds on Atlantic white cedar. Now, Atlantic white cedar can form dense, deep, dark stands and be a late successional tree for sure, but they only feed on Atlantic white cedar when it's in a young forest. They will not feed on Atlantic white cedar that's in a long, old established forest. They actually need the youngest growth of the youngest trees, and especially places where there's nearby wildflowers, which you're not going to find deep in a cedar swamp. They're going to have to be lots of edge ecotone wildflowers like the ones that you see here. And then we used to have naturally occurring in New Jersey and South Jersey especially, bobwhites. We wiped them out, completely extirpated from the state of New Jersey, and they have been reintroduced into, I believe, 2 or 3 places now. I'm not sure how many we're up to, but they're really specialists on edges and early successional areas. So I remember still hearing them when I was a kid, but it's been a little while, and I've got to go back to some of the places where they reintroduced them to try to hear them again because it would be nice. And then another thing we have to think of too is that succession is a type of habitat loss. Other new habitat will form afterwards, which is great, but it is a type of habitat loss as well. And so if you do nothing, if there's no fire, if there's no tornado, if there's no forestry, if there's no nothing, eventually this area here of a young forest is going to get encroached and removed by succession and become much more homogeneous over time. And again, I want to be very clear. All stages of succession are important. So that's okay to have some of that. That's good. But you are losing some habitat too. So if young forests are rare, then doing nothing with young forests, if there's no prescribed burning, if there's no forestry, if there's none of that going on, you will lose that habitat. And so fire is the natural way that this would have always happened historically. Fire was the way in South Jersey, especially, that succession really would get reset on a regular basis. So here's an interesting figure that I found from an article written by Pan et al. In 2011 in the journal Biogeosciences, where they actually looked at the stand age of forested areas in the United States and Canada. And you can see from this particular graph here, if you look at New Jersey, most of that is in the like 40 to 60, 80-ish range of age of trees. So basically middle-aged, right? There's not a lot of young, there's not a lot of old. It's mostly kind of middle-aged, and it's very consistent. There's not a lot of variation. If you look up in Canada, you'll see there's incredible amounts of heterogeneity. There's tons and tons of variation of really young, really old, all the different stages all together. A lot of that is a lot more natural. Ours tends to be very young. If you look at the southeastern United States, it's going to be, again, early middle-aged. It's going to be in the like 20 range, 20 to 30. A lot of that is going to be. And so, there's not, if you notice, there's not a lot of 0 to 5, not a lot of 6 to 10, not a lot of 11 to 15 in the southeastern United States or the northeastern United States or the western United States. And when there is, it's typically in plantations where they're growing for paper. So a lot of that is not actually very natural forest. This is a really interesting figure here. So this is showing the standard deviation of stand ages of forested areas. And so standard deviation is a measure of how much variation there is. So if you look at the eastern United States, they're very, very green, very low numbers, meaning there's almost no variation. Almost every tree is the same age as the trees around it. There are, of course, some older or some younger trees, but overwhelmingly, with a few exceptions in a forest, they're going to be of a similar age. Whereas when you get into the Pacific Northwest, there's wildly higher amounts of standard deviation. So you have very old growth, very young growth, early successional young forest, super old growth. It's really interesting how there's a lot more diversity in those places. So in the early 1900s, up to 60% of northeastern forests were shrublands and young forests. 60%. This is an incredibly high amount. I have a question. Maybe we can do a real quick one, see if anybody has a guess here. How much of New Jersey's forest is currently shrublands and young forests, so under 20 years old? I don't know if we can do that in the chat. Rich, can we do that?
Yes, we can do it right in the chat, or we can do it. It's certainly fine. If anybody has an idea, post it in the chat.
Okay, I see a 20%, 35%.
35, 25, 30, 10, 15, 60.
Okay, interesting. All interesting numbers. The correct answer is 3% as of 2019. Unbelievably rare at this point compared to what used to be the dominant stage, which supported most of the biodiversity that occurred here in the northeastern United States. We're down to 3%, 1/20th of what it used to be. Now, this is a well-known species that has heavily suffered due to loss of young forest. This here is a golden wing warbler. It's certainly not the only species that's affected, but it's what we often call a flagship species, where it's so there's a lot of conservation efforts to protect golden wing warblers. And unfortunately, many people either they don't realize this or they intentionally mislead and say, well, it's just saving one species. It is not saving one species. This is, again, a flagship species. It is a surrogate for an entire suite of biodiversity that all lives in the same kind of places as this species. It's just one that enables it to be manageable and have basically a face to it as well. So this is great habitat for a golden wing warbler. But like I said, it's not just the golden wing warbler. When you create this young forest habitat, you increase habitats for things like eastern towhees, things like northeastern cottontails, and elderberry longhorn beetles, and milkweeds like our purple milkweed, and different species of goldenrods and mourning cloaks and rough green snakes, and all kinds of things that benefit from this change where there's a lot of middle-aged forest and some of it gets renewed as young forest. That is a huge benefit to literally thousands of species. It is not one species. It is literally thousands of species.
Well, like, for example, Sparta Mountain, we visited there, and they went, when they did this young successional project, they went from 9 species to over 40 in birds.
It does not surprise me.
No.
I mean, it makes sense. So let's get into the vital importance of early successional habitats. So most biodiversity is found in early successional habitats. That's well established. We talked about that. But one of the questions that people ask me sometimes, most of the time people don't ask me this to my face, but sometimes they do, is why should we even care about biodiversity in the first place? And so I want to talk about ecosystem services. This is a really important concept. And here's a good definition: the conditions and processes through which natural ecosystems and the species that make them up sustain and fulfill human life. So basically, what is biodiversity doing for you? And quite a lot. It's quite a lot. One of the most important ecosystem services is pollination. The vast majority of pollinators are found in old fields, field forest ecotones, and young forests. I mean, we're talking well over 95%. Once again, here we see an old field, soon to be a shrubland, soon to be a young forest. But in this stage right here, it is incredibly densely packed with wildflowers and is going to have tons and tons of pollinator diversity. Here's our ecotone from a young forest into a field, and we can see all the different types of flowers there the pollinators would visit. Plants rely very heavily on pollinators. Nearly 90% of plants are pollinated by insects. So if you lose the pollinating insects, if you lose all those flowers that are in early successional and ecotone habitats, you're talking about huge, huge loss. And the estimated value of insect pollinators to agriculture in the US is about $40 billion annually. So keeping populations of pollinators present in these natural areas means they will be able to go out and colonize agricultural areas as well. And again, that is worth at least 40 billion. That's 2005 numbers. It's probably more like 60 to 80 billion now at this point. The last time I checked, it was estimated to be more in that range. So it's a lot of money. And not only that, forget money, you can eat. That's important. So European honeybees are what people often talk about when we talk about pollination, and I understand that. They're not native. They do engage in some of the pollination of crops in North America. It's actually a lot less than we realized. In the last 5 to 10 years, there's a lot of research saying our native pollinators are doing considerably more. But honeybees are here, and we can't get honey without honeybees. But we really need to think about a lot of our native bees, including about 4,000 species in North America. Unfortunately, many of them are rare now, and one of the reasons is the loss of young forests and ecotones. So here's another thing. Climate change mitigation. Young forests absorb significant amounts of carbon dioxide from the air. Now, you will regularly hear about how old growth forests are major sinks of carbon, and they are absolutely. But what people don't realize, and this is published recently in one of the most prestigious journals in the entire world, PNAS stands for Proceedings in the National Academy of Sciences. This is a role of forest regrowth in global carbon sink dynamics. The take home is young forests absorb 25% more carbon than old forests. They may not be as big, but they're sucking in a lot more because there's a lot more young growth. So those trunks of those old growth forests, absolutely massive amounts of carbon in them. There's no question. And so what I'm not saying is that we should cut down all of our old forests and turn everything into young forests. I don't think anybody's saying that. Unfortunately, there's a straw man argument where people sometimes, pretend that that's being said. But what I am saying is the young forests are actively absorbing tons and tons and tons and tons of carbon. It's not as stored, but it's being absorbed actively right now as much as possible. And actually, again, it's a considerable amount of the total global carbon sink dynamics is young forest. So let's talk about some recent research on forest management and how we can see what's going on there. So the first thing I want to say is what I'm not talking about. So this here is deforestation, which is not what I'm talking about. Deforestation is when you completely denude an area of trees and turn it into something else, like typically agriculture. So this is about to become an oil palm plantation. By the way, there's probably nothing in the world more unsustainable than palm oil. So there's so many causes we could pick up here, but that's one of mine, is try to cut down on your palm oil because it's basically causing rainforests to go away. But anyway, so this is about to be a palm oil plantation. So these trees have no chance of coming back. No natural grasslands and shrublands and young forests are going to come back because it's all going to be replanted densely with oil palms. So that's what we're going to see here. What I'm talking about when we're talking about forest management and ecologically sustainable forest management is areas where after trees are removed, it becomes regrowth. It goes through succession again. It gets a chance to do that. And these are all pictures of areas that have had some amount of forest management and have actually created habitats for incredibly diverse plants and animals. And so all of these are, in my mind, pictures of successes, either in the making or places that have already become successful. So there are many different ways that forestry occurs. Again, I'm not a forester. I want to be really clear about that, right? So I'm not going to get into forestry in any great detail, but what I'm going to briefly say is, there's types of forestry like including clear cutting, where you take a whole bunch of trees out of an area and completely remove them, to things where there's thinning, where there's something where maybe you're just selecting little pods, little groups, or individual trees. And so there's a whole continuum from taking everything to just taking individual trees that you want. Um, Now, this here was a study, it was a fairly famous study in the journal Ecosphere a few years ago, where they actually showed the bird species richness, which means the total number of biodiversity of birds. They showed that it went up considerably in the different types of forest management that had been done compared to no harvest. The NH stands for no harvest. THN is for thinning. G is for selective. I don't remember what the G stands for. CC is for clear cut. So those are all different ways of doing forestry. The first three, and NH means no harvest. And the diversity of birds is higher after management occurs. This is another picture of a different study done in 2016. This was another fairly famous study where they showed everything after harvest. The harvest is shown at the dotted line, went up considerably in areas where there was some sort of active management being done, whether it be patch cut, shelter trees, single tree cutting, whatever. It actually went up significantly higher, the bird diversity in those places. An interesting thing is to think about stuff where we kind of expect them to go down after forestry. So there's this is a study that was done where they were looking at moths, especially forest moths that live in late successional forests. And what they found was certain types of forestry, things like coppice and rides and different types of things, where there's some areas that are cut in different ways. Again, I'm not an expert in it. I just know that there's different ways that they do some selective tree cutting and some opening. Those did not have they still had tons of moths. They did not have as significant of a change in moth diversity as the actual standard woodland in those areas. So that was surprising, because it was expected that there was going to be a dramatic decrease, but it turns out most of the forest, as long as you leave most of it, you can take some, you still keep a lot of your moths. And when they looked at this with rare species, it was even more consistently that way. Some of these treatments, like with the wide ride, was really not even different from a standard woodland. So that was interesting. And then let's talk about a meta-analysis. So this is a extremely important thing, because there's a problem, and the media has this problem all the time, where they say they fall into the single study trap, where there's one single study and it says something, and sometimes that study is different from what everybody else is saying, because they either have bad methods, or they just got lucky or whatever. And sometimes that single study is great. But the problem is when you only focus on a single study rather than a conglomerate of many studies, you don't know if that study is necessarily representative. Now, maybe if you're an expert, you can evaluate it better, but your average person from the media or the public doesn't know how to evaluate scientific literature. And so there can be things called meta-analyses that are really valuable, because what they're going to do is looking at dozens or even hundreds of studies all at once and seeing, are there general patterns that we can derive from all of the research that's been done, not just one study. And so here's a paper called "Can Retention Forestry Help Conserve Biodiversity?" And when they say retention forestry, they're talking about leaving some trees when there's forestry work being done. And this was a meta-analysis of 78 different studies, including almost 1,000 comparisons of biodiversity between retention cuts and clear cuts or unharvested forest. And so let's look and see what we found here. So this is showing when there was clear cuts. It was surprising. This is a little bit surprising. I figured the clear cuts were going to be pretty terrible, but actually they really weren't. The clear cut, the diversity of different things like birds was higher in clear cuts than it was when there was no forest management done. Things like plants, higher. Again, a lot of these are going to be early successional specialists, so that's not surprising. Mammals and beetles went ever so slightly down, but it was not statistically significant. Those error bars show you that it was not different from zero. What is interesting is when there was some forest management done, there was higher diversity of the majority of things that were looked at in these particular studies. Amphibians were about the same. Birds were higher, mammals were higher, invertebrates were about the same, spiders were higher, beetles were higher, plants were higher, lichens were about the same. The only thing that actually significantly went down after some forestry was being done was bryophytes. And bryophytes is a group of obscure plants. There's very few species, and they're really deep, dark forest specialists, so it's not surprising. But the vast majority of things did go up. And so some of the take-home messages of this study, of this meta-analysis, they said retention cuts supported higher total species richness, meaning the total amount of biodiversity, and greater levels of abundance when compared with clear cuts. Okay, so clear cuts are not as good as when you leave some trees. That's not surprising. There was also a positive effect of retention cuts on both total species richness and total species abundance compared to forests. And so areas that had never been, treated in any way with any type of forestry did not do as well with biodiversity. So that's not surprising. So here is an example. This is fresh off of an email that I just got the other day from a colleague who said, well, there's some areas where we're doing some management, we're doing some thinning, and we're leaving trees, and we're finding some of the rarest snakes in New Jersey are in the highest densities you're going to find anywhere in these places that have had some forest management. And again, this is going to emulate in a lot of ways windstorms or fires that are going to cause some trees to die and then become logs and become coarse woody debris. The pine snakes in this particular place, and it's endangered species, so I can't really talk about exactly where it was. Pine snakes were unbelievably high there, as were the timber rattlesnakes, as were the corn snakes, all three endangered in the state of New Jersey. So this is incredible. This is a really incredible thing. And again, this kind of forest management can be done in a way. They're working with Bob Zappalordi, who's a herpetologist and a fantastic conservation biologist. And this forest management is the best thing we have right now for maintaining some of these rare species. And so I want to talk just a little bit. Like I said, I'm not going to get into like details and logistics of it because I'm not a forester, but just sort of broad strokes, talking about creating and maintaining young forests. I know many of the people in the audience are interested in this. If you have a property with some acres of your own, you could do things that might really help, especially cutting and leaving some trees on the ground would be fantastic. You can get involved, whether that involve different types of forestry, fire, other things. There's ways to do this. And so there's a website called the youngforest.org, youngforest.org. It's called the Young Forest Project. They have lots of great information on how to actually do this if you want to do this. So I'm not going to just read off their website all of the suggestions they have, but one of the things that's really important is invasive species management. This is really important because when there are disturbances, invasive species can come in. It's more likely to happen in areas that were previously agriculture than in areas that were previously more natural forests. But there's invasive species are a problem absolutely everywhere. Absolutely everywhere. So that's a really important thing. One thing that gets brought up a lot, and I've heard some people talk about this in northwestern New Jersey. People say, oh, well, when they're doing forest management, they're creating habitats of young forest, it's really important to make sure none of the vernal ponds have forestry happen near them. That's not actually true. So this is based again on the unfortunate one size fits all mentality, and nature doesn't work that way. So it's good, absolutely, to keep forests near some of the vernal ponds because some of these species are going to need water that stays fairly shaded and fairly cool compared to other areas, but that's not all species of frogs and salamanders. There are ones that need big, open, sunny vernal ponds. Many species need that. So I remember when I heard about some of the projects that were going on in northwestern New Jersey, and people are like, well, they absolutely cannot forest anywhere near vernal ponds. That is just straight up not biology. That is not how it works. We need both. And so there are different types of things that can be done. But one of the things I really want to focus on here in the upper right-hand picture is leaving some trees. Even if you remove a lot of trees, you got to leave some trees. Leaving trees is spectacularly important for small mammals, for wood-boring insects, for snakes, for foxes, for all kinds of things. Really, really important. And again, if you have the ability to do some fire too, that's great. I don't know, what your situation is going to be, but it's certainly something worth looking into. And again, managing invasive species is really important. So for maximum ecological benefit, even if you don't have a forest, or maybe you have a small woodlot or something, you can add native shrubs and young trees to your landscape and maybe create your own ecotone in an area where maybe you have some forest that backs up to, a lawn, and maybe you can take like 5-10% of that lawn and turn it into a border and make it something that has native plants. And why does it matter if the plant is native? A lot has been said about this, so I'm not going to talk about it too long, but just really quickly. Um, Here's a couple of examples of butterflies that we have in our area. There's a red admiral butterfly and there's a monarch butterfly. Both of them are nectaring on an exotic plant, not a native plant, an exotic plant called butterfly bush. And so people think, oh, that's good. It's not native, but it's really good for butterflies. Well, here's the thing. That's basically Gatorade when you're running a marathon. You can't train for a marathon by only consuming Gatorade. You'll never make it. It's the very, 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 very end where that is relevant. So they get nectar when they're ready to finish their life cycle. They're going to disperse and they're going to lay eggs somewhere, but their whole almost all their nutrition comes from their young stage. In fact, almost all feeding in the vast majority of insects is done in the immature stages, and that is almost exclusively done on native plants. Well over 90% of species that are native to New Jersey feed on exclusively or almost exclusively native plants. And so this is a really important thing. So in order to do that, we should think about what we want to plant that is native. And great study out of Doug Tallamy's lab recently, just a few years ago, they showed that just a few keystone plant genera support the majority of butterfly and moth species. And so what that keystone plant genera just means groups of plants that are, closely related. So all of the oaks, all of the willows, all of the cherries, they are really supporting 85%. Just the top 5 support 85% of our insects. Just the top 5 genera. So, let's talk about some of those ones that we want to bring back. Like oaks. Oaks are the best. Oaks are number one. If you look at this graph here, Quercus is oak, Salix is willow, Prunus is cherries, Pinus or pines, Populus or poplars, Betula or birches. And so you can see like clearly some of these ones at the top, we should be considering putting them in either when we're doing some sort of forestry management or again, creating ecotones. So going back to this picture here, I see an area that could be managed in such a way as to create valuable ecotone habitat. Let's talk about some great suggestions that we could get here. Here we go. Prairie willow. This occurs, even despite the name being prairie, it actually does occur in South Jersey. Salix humilis, beautiful plant, really great. Doesn't get real big, so it's a nice plant for a landscape. It's not going to kind of outgrow its area. It has pretty flowers on it. They're going to be, I think, largely wind pollinated, but I believe that some pollinating insects do visit them as well. American pussy willow is another great willow. Salix discolor. Fantastic, really beautiful. I mean, people love this plant. And so this is a great one to put. And you can see this looks like a perfect ecotone type habitat here. Willows get this butterfly. This is one of my favorite butterflies. This is a mourning cloak. And mourning cloaks come out in the earliest of spring, like basically when the temperature hits like 60 degrees outside, they're out. You'll see them in March sometimes. And you say, how can a butterfly be out in March? Because they don't come out of the caterpillar stage in the spring. Oh no, they did that the previous year. They actually overwinter as adult butterflies under bark. So they're ready to go right away in the spring. They don't have to go through their whole life cycle. They're already there. They're already adults in the winter. They're already adults in the early spring. So as soon as it hits 60 degrees, they come out. But they will feed either exclusively or almost exclusively on willows. Here's another willow feeder. This is a beautiful, beautiful moth. One of my favorites. By wing area, it is the largest moth in North America. This is a Cecropia moth. Absolutely gorgeous. Love willows. And this here is one of the best bird pictures I have ever seen. Blaine Rothhauser let me use this picture. This is a willow flycatcher. And not surprisingly, they do like to hang out in willows on a regular basis. Here's another great plant, Arrowwood viburnum. awesome ecotone, awesome plant to throw into an edge. Really gorgeous, looks great all 4 seasons of the year, has nice white flowers, which turn into blue fruits. And it's just a great plant. It's a really fantastic plant for a lot of butterflies and moths. American plum. We have native plums. We have actually many species of native plums. This is one of my favorites, and there's an added benefit of it produces delicious edible plums if you want to eat it. But it looks gorgeous. It's very closely related to cherries because, well, actually, it is plums are a type of cherry, and looks really great. Nice flowers, nice early spring flowers. And then we have our service berries. Service berries are awesome. Service berries are also closely related to cherries, not as close as a plum is, but they are wonderful for wildlife. So really, when you come right down to it, I just want to sort of reiterate, let's look at the whole thing. Let's look at all of these stages, not just the end. And let's remember that the early stages are where the most diversity occurs. So I want to just end this real quick with a little plug to the Southeastern Grassland Initiative as well. Actually, I think they just changed their name to the Southeastern Grassland Institute, but they still kept SGI. Anyway, so it's nice to have grasslands next to young forests, next to, just a great thing to do. I'd like to acknowledge some people that helped with this presentation. Many of the great photographs were taken by Jason Sepka, who's a fantastic photographer. Gift Beaton took a number of pictures of birds and dragonflies. Sharon and Wade Wander took some great habitat pictures. Uli Larmer also did as well. Blaine Rothhauser, I got several of my bird pictures from him. Steve Roman, I think, gave me one. Maybe that was a tiger wheel picture. I can't remember. And I had some great discussions with several people about this, including our dear departed friend, Jamie Cromarty. And so, yeah, that's what I've got. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Hey, anyone who has any questions, just put them in the chat and we will respond to them. I think there's a question in Q&A at the moment. There's also 2 hands up. If you have a question, please type it into the chat. And the question in the Q&A is, what was the stage of the New Jersey forests in the 1600s?
Well, that's a great question. We don't have great records for a lot of the different time slices because I looked into this. And I was really, really, really interested to find that out as well. The only numbers that I could find are the ones that I put up there. We know that like pre colonialism, there was probably a very high percentage, like around 60%. I don't know. A lot of times people talk about how Native Americans managed ecological habitats in the eastern United States, and they definitely managed it for more open succession than probably happened quite before then, before people came to North America from Eurasia. So that's a really interesting question. I'd love to get an exact number, but the one thing I can say is it's a lot higher than it was today. I don't know what it was, but that's a great question.
So there's a couple of questions now popping up in the chat. I think you could see them already, Dan. There's a question about reviewing the list of native plants that I can plant after having done some forest management.
I have some lists, and I can actually send them to you, Rich, or Andy, and those could be distributed through email or something like that. Is that an option?
Well, we have a way to distribute things. We also could append it to the YouTube channel where we will have this video up. So that would be an appropriate place.
Yeah. Okay. Excellent. So there's a lot of things moving quickly, so I'm not seeing them all, but I just saw, is there a quail bobwhite restoration project in New Jersey? Yes, there absolutely is. In fact, there's several of them. I know one of the places they were reintroduced is Wheelabrator in like on the Delaware River, not too far from like Gloucester City and Camden, all that kind of stuff. So that's a great question. I don't know who's in charge of that, but I would imagine we could probably Google that one and figure it out. But there's definitely definitely quail restoration being done in New Jersey, and I know that the quail that they reintroduced were brought from Georgia. I do know that because I was talking to people early on when it happened, but I can look into that a little bit more too.
Can you address, I assume, the role of deer as preventing succession?
Deer, deer, deer. Um, we have a deer problem, as we all know. It complicates everything. Um, so certain plants are very, very, very attractive to deer, and certain plants are not. One of the reasons that a lot of our early, mid, and late successional forests are not doing as well as they could be is because of the fact that deer destroy the understory. They just destroy it. This happens in every successional stage. And so this is a challenge. If I had an answer for this, I'd be a billionaire. There's no great answer. I mean, if depending on where you live, if you have the means or you're not talking about a gigantic area, you can do deer exclusion fences. They do work really well if they're done right. There's always, the Fish and Wildlife Service and other agencies regularly employ sharpshooters to reduce the number of deer that we have in an area because they are so severely overpopulated due to a lack of predators. We don't have the predators we used to have. We don't have eastern gray wolves. We don't have mountain lions. We just don't have them anymore. And so one of the things that I often suggest is trying to plant things that are ecologically beneficial, but also less attractive to deer. So things like for example, here's a good plant that is great for a great wildflower. Goldenrods, especially sweet goldenrod, fantastic wildflower. Deer don't seem to like them. They won't touch them, or they don't eat them much. They got to be pretty much starving before they'll feed on them. So yeah, it's a really good question. It's a really tough question. All right. Rich, do we have any other questions I didn't see or?
Yeah. Well, there's some discussion here about ash trees, but that's a general problem that we've experienced with the emerald ash borer that
Yeah.
is going to time itself out at some point, and we'll have to move forward and face the next issue. When
Yeah,
you talk
exactly.
about these older forests, so the mature forests, are you suggesting also that there be activity at the various stages to maintain the forest or work towards forest resiliency and sustainability as they reach more mature levels so that there would be an constant maintenance of the forest through forestry activity?
I mean, it's good to have, it's always good to be on top of things like, for example, having people on top of invasive species. There are invasive species that get into not just early successional habitats, but into mid and late as well. And it's good to have just a general awareness of those things. Um, I mean, there are some that we probably would be fine to just largely kind of leave them once they get to old growth stage, leave them largely alone. But one of the things you mentioned Sparta Mountain. I think one of the things about that is there's some really old trees there, and it's really great. Taking a very small percentage of it, like 10%, and making it young successional forest on the edge of what's otherwise older growth is a fantastic ecological thing. But nobody that I know would suggest cutting all of the old growth forest down and turning it all into young forest. That's absurd. Nobody I know would ever suggest that. And so that's an important thing is that people have to understand that distinction. Taking a small percentage and turning it into young forest benefits the old growth, benefits everything that lives there, and allows for heterogeneity. And that's really the key here is heterogeneity. Yeah.
There's a question in here on what are referred to as gypsy moths now,
Yeah, they now call them
spongy
spongy
moths.
moths. Yeah.
Yes. And I guess this is a reference to different predators we've dealt with, the Asian longhorn beetles, emerald ash, and deer. But I guess the person's asking, what can we do about these problems going forward?
Yeah, so I mean, this is really beyond anything that we were getting into here. I mean, I don't mind the question, but this is really just a bigger, bigger, bigger issue. That's, I mean, this is really very little to do with early successional, and more to do with a just general ecological problem of bringing species from other parts of the world into our area and vice versa, because many of our native species become severe pests in Europe and Asia. And we think about all the invasive plants in North America. Well, they're dealing with our coreopsis. They're dealing with our goldenrods. Like our beautiful goldenrods are just destroying Asia right now. And so, how do we deal with this? It's tough. It's a global world. Everything moves. And we have APHIS is the Agricultural Plant Health Inspection Service. Their whole job is to be homeland security for biodiversity, and they do a really good job, but they can't catch everything, and so it's really, really difficult. And so, and it's a great question. Like the thing about emerald ash borer is, what do you do? Do you say, well, just give up on ashes? I hate that idea. To just say, well, that's it. Never plant another ash. Never ever think of ashes in the future. Maybe that's going to happen and we won't have any say in it. But I don't know. I've heard people say, oh, we can't plant this. We can't plant this because there's this new pest that's going to come in and destroy this. Everything's eventually going to get somebody, and so we have to just do the best we can, and trying to keep as many things that are native in the landscape as we can. And sometimes we're going to deal with them. We're going to get emerald ash borers and we're going to have a maybe losing battle. But I think we got to try the best we can. And like I said, if I had a good answer for what to do about things like how do we stop invasive species, I would be a trillionaire. So, I
Yep.
mean,
Actually, if you scroll back to the first item in the chat, it's from one of the directors of the Forestry Association, and it says, "I'm planning a deer-fenced American chestnut planting to create a permanent young successional forest." So it's sort of like when you were asking the question about ash, what are we going to do? Do we want to give up? He's saying, I'm not giving up on chestnut.
I like it. I like it. Yeah, there's actually a couple of really cool things going on with chestnuts, and we have a chance of actually maybe bringing them back. There have been various projects looking at selective breeding and finding the only ones with resistance, and back crossing them with, and just doing stuff. And who knows, they're already at the point where we might have some stuff pretty soon. But that's a really creative idea. Deer fence American chestnut to create a permanent young successional farm. And American chestnut are actually really good at supporting a lot of biodiversity. They just never get a chance to get to fruiting age because they get hit with the blight. So I want to hear more about that in the future.
Well, we'll hook you up with Clark. It's not a problem.
Yeah, that's a very
He'll be happy to
interesting
chat with you
idea.
about it. Yep.
Yeah.
And there's a note here. How can we get a copy of this presentation? It will be posted on our YouTube channel as a video. You can view it anytime, and there'll be a link on our webpage as well during next month featuring that video. So that's how that will work. So are there any other questions from anyone? And what? Something just popped. So let's see. Nope, just a note. Dan, you had selected a number from 1 to 25 earlier, and we were going to give that book away to someone who's still on the call. So if anybody in the chat wants to enter a number between 1 and 25, the first one to hit the number that Dan picked will win that book. Keep going.
I saw it. BW.
You got it?
BW. Got it.
Got it. BW got it. BW, send us an email to njforestry@gmail.com with your address, and we'll send you that book.
Bridger Welsh. Yeah. Or Welch.
That's a person we know well.
Okay.
Excellent. Excellent. In fact, we were just chatting yesterday. So, but it's not fixed. In any event, any more questions or thoughts or comments? I guess everyone's saying thank you, and we thank you all for attending. Dan, any closing remark?
No, I really appreciate everybody coming here. Thank you so much. Love the feedback and great questions, and really hoping that this will get people thinking about this stuff. So thank you so much.
Well, Dan, it was an extraordinary presentation, so we're indebted to you for it. And we'll get it up on the website as soon as possible, because I'm sure there'll be a lot of demand to see it again.
Okay, great.
So thank you.
All right, I'm trying to figure out how to stop. There we go.